In the early 1800s, Elias Barrett, a farmer who had fled the darkness and struggles of Europe, arrived in a remote part of the United States with his wife, Helga, and their grown son, Anton. It was a time when the country was expanding westward and land was cheap for those willing to work it. When Elias found an open stretch of land surrounded by ancient woods, he believed he had stumbled upon his family's salvation. The soil seemed dark and rich, perfect for the crops he planned to plant. But as Elias and his family soon discovered, the land held more than the promise of a prosperous future. It held secrets that should never have been unearthed. Join me on this haunting tale and any of my other horror fictions by subscribing to the channel. I write all my own material and would be elated to have you join me on this quest to make some of the scariest stories around. Now, back to the terrifying tale of what would later become known as the Barrett Farm. From the moment the first shovel struck the ground, there was a sense that something lay beneath the surface. Something that shuddered when disturbed. The first few nights after breaking the earth, the family heard faint sounds, soft murmurs carried on the breeze, as if the soil itself whispered of ancient things that should have been left undisturbed. The sounds seemed to come from the fields, growing louder each night as the furrows deepened and the plows dug further into the earth. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a sensation like a slow breath exhaled from deep underground. Elias was not one to be easily frightened. He dismissed the whispers as tricks of the wind and the tension in his bones as nothing more than fatigue from a long day's work. But Anton felt differently. As he plowed the fields, he sometimes saw what looked like dark figures flickering in the distance. At the edges of his vision, just beyond the tree line. When he looked directly, there was nothing, just the waving tall grass and the thick trees swaying in the wind. The feeling lingered, though, a sense that they were not alone, that something old and unseen was watching. Then, one evening, the family dog, a loyal and spirited companion, went missing. They searched for days, calling its name until their voices were hoarse. Helga stayed up late, leaving the front lantern burning as a beacon, but when the dog finally returned, it was lifeless. Its fur matted and covered in dirt. There was a terrible wound on its side, as though something had taken a bite from it, but the edges of the wound were blackened, as if burned. Helga wept as Elias buried the dog behind the house. But even as he dug the grave, he could not shake the feeling that he was disturbing something best left untouched. The farm continued to resist them at every turn. The crops grew unnaturally, their leaves thick and dark but twisted and tangled, as though the plants themselves recoiled from the light of day. Even the old oak tree at the edge of the field seemed to bend lower, its branches reaching out like gnarled fingers toward the farmhouse. In an attempt to ward off bad luck, Elias fashioned a scarecrow. He took an old suit of clothes and stuffed it with straw, using a burlap sack for the head, which he stitched together with rough thread. He added a crude face, 2 uneven eyes, and a wide, crooked smile that was meant to frighten off birds, but only succeeded in unsettling the family. The scarecrow stood tall in the middle of the field, its button eyes gleaming in the moonlight like watchful guards. But as the days passed, the figure seemed to age quickly, as though the land was leeching the life from it. The burlap sagged, and its smile grew more grotesque with each passing night. There were times when Elias thought he saw it move. Just a slight shift, as if it was bending to whisper to the soil. He would shake his head and dismiss it as a trick of the eyes, but the whispers that seemed to emanate from the fields grew louder and clearer, as if the scarecrow was somehow listening to them or speaking to them. It was after the Scarecrow's arrival that Anton began to change. He grew distant, his eyes hollow and ringed with shadows. He confessed to his father that he felt drawn to the Scarecrow, that he could hear voices at night calling his name, telling him to come closer. Elias dismissed his son's fears as childish nonsense, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. One night, when the moon was nothing more than a thin crescent hanging in the sky, Anton vanished. Helga found his bed empty and his boots gone. They searched the fields, calling out in the dark, but their voices seemed to disappear into the night, swallowed up by the endless stretch of crooked crops and the thickening fog that rolled in from the woods. When they reached the Scarecrow, Elias noticed something he hadn't before. The Scarecrow's hands were no longer stuffed with straw, but appeared to be covered with a thin layer of mud, as though they had recently clawed their way out of the earth. Days turned into weeks, and Anton never returned. The farm grew quieter with a sadness, but there was an underlying hum that never ceased, a low vibration in the soil that seemed to resonate through the walls of the farmhouse, even in the dead of night. Helga swore she could hear Anton's voice at times, distant and muffled, as if calling to them from somewhere deep underground. The Scarecrow, meanwhile, seemed to decay at an alarming rate. Its face grew darker, almost black, and its clothes hung in tatters, though no storm or rain had touched it. Then Elias began to dream. In these dreams, he found himself walking the fields under a blood-red sky, the air thick with the smell of decay. The Scarecrow stood in the distance, its limbs twisted and jerking as if moving through some unseen force. Elias could see faces in the folds of its burlap head, shadows of people screaming in silent terror. One night, he woke to find himself standing in the middle of the field, mud clinging to his bare feet with no memory of how he even got there. The Scarecrow loomed in front of him, closer than it should have been, its crooked smile impossibly wide. It wasn't long after that Elias disappeared too. Helga awoke one morning to find his side of the bed cold, the front door hanging open, and muddy footprints trailing out into the fields. She searched for hours, but found nothing, only the empty fields and the Scarecrow, which now looked more lifelike than ever. The eyes were no longer buttons, they glistened wetly in the dim light, and the mouth seemed to twitch at the corners, almost as if it was trying to speak. The next day, a stranger came to the farm. He was a tall man with dark eyes and a voice like gravel, introducing himself as Gideon Thorne, a drifter who claimed to know about the land's history. He offered to help Helga with the farm to keep it running in Elias's absence. She was hesitant, but desperation made her accept. Thorne worked tirelessly, often at night, and took a particular interest in the Scarecrow, which he seemed to tend to more than the crops themselves. Sometimes Helga could watch him talking to it in low tones, his voice inches from the burlap head, and at those times she would retreat to the house, clutching a crucifix. Helga didn't last much longer. The whispers became too much for her to bear, the voices too real, too familiar. One morning, Thorne found her in the attic, her body cold and stiff. With her passing, the farm fell completely under Thorne's care, and he took to it as though it had always been his. The years turned into decades, and the farmhouse rotted away, yet Thorne remained. He never aged, and the Scarecrow never seemed to fully decay, no matter how many seasons passed. Whenever someone wandered onto the property, lured by stories of fertile soil and the promise of prosperity, Thorne was there, always watching, always smiling. Those who bought the land soon found the air thick with an unshakable gloom, and before long they would leave, abandoning the farm back to Thorne's strange stewardship. But with each new owner, there seemed to be another Scarecrow erected. They would appear overnight, fashioned from old clothes and burlap, their forms slumping over in the fields like silent sentries. And with each scarecrow, the whispers grew louder, the voices more desperate, like something beneath the earth was slowly clawing its way up. In the late 1800s, Jacob Hayes bought the land. Unlike those before him, he dismissed the old tales of the cursed farm as nonsense. Thorne, ever the friendly caretaker, welcomed him with open arms, even offering to stay on and help manage the land. "It's a good place," Thorne assured Jacob, "as long as you keep the scarecrows up." Jacob passed on the offer. Jacob took the land at a price that seemed almost too good to be true. Thorne left not long after, but the air felt heavier in his absence, and Jacob found himself haunted by strange dreams, just as Elias had been. It wasn't long before the whispers began again, drifting up from the ground like mist, carrying voices that called out names Jacob didn't recognize, but always ended with his own. Years passed, and the land lay mostly untouched, as if the very soil itself had grown tired of devouring those who dared to claim it. In modern times, developers finally saw the potential in the old farm, believing they could turn it into a new suburban neighborhood. They cleared the fields and began construction, tearing down the decaying farmhouse and uprooting the old scarecrows, which had somehow survived the passage of all this time. As they dug deeper, the excavator struck something solid just below the surface. They unearthed a shallow grave filled with human bones, some old, others disturbingly recent. The remains were twisted and broken, as if the bodies had been forced into the earth by something stronger than nature itself. The discovery should have halted the work immediately, but there was an eagerness to develop the land, to cast away its dark history with concrete and steel. But as the workers continued their excavation, something else emerged. A sense of being watched, a coldness that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. It was subtle at first, a chill that hung in the air. Then the feeling grew sharper, like a pair of unseen eyes observing every movement. The workers soon noticed the scarecrows standing on the edge of the construction site, half buried in the overgrown grass. No one remembered them being placed there. They had been moved far from the fields for disposal, but here they were, leaning in the mist like gaunt, silent figures watching over a shallow grave. The scarecrows were unsettlingly detailed. Their button eyes seemed to gleam wetly in the fog, and the fabric that had once been dull and worn appeared darker, as if stained with something fresh. Some of the workers swore they saw the scarecrows shift when they turned their backs, a subtle leaning or twitching of a hand. But when they looked closer, the scarecrows were always perfectly still. One worker went missing on the third day of digging. The others found his shovel lying near the freshly dug grave, but no trace of him remained, not even a single footprint leading away. The scarecrows seemed to loom even closer, their crooked burlap faces slack with gaping mouths and hollow eyes. The workers grew uneasy, and whispers spread that the land was cursed, that something old and evil had been awakened when they broke the ground. The next night, a thick fog rolled in, much heavier than any before, engulfing the construction site in a suffocating shroud. As visibility faded to almost nothing, one of the workers stumbled back toward his truck after a late shift. His flashlight beam cut through the haze, catching glimmers of movement just at the edge of the light. He swung the beam around and saw a dark shape, a scarecrow, half seen through the mist, standing much closer than he remembered. He walked faster, his breath coming in panic gasps, and glanced over his shoulder. The scarecrow was closer still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Suddenly, he heard a rustling behind him, like the dry scratch of straw dragging along the ground. He turned to face the noise and saw it. The scarecrow had moved. It was no longer bound by the stake that should have held it upright. It slumped forward as if walking, its joints creaking with the strain of movement. He screamed, but his voice seemed swallowed by the fog. And when the other workers found him the next morning, he was curled up at the edge of the construction site, his hair gone white and his eyes wide open, staring unblinking at the place where the scarecrow had stood. The developers called the local authorities and work on the site was halted, but the scarecrows continued to appear, arranged around the shallow grave like mourners at a funeral. Each time they were removed, they would return with strange new details, a piece of fabric that looked like the torn sleeve of a worker's uniform, or a burlap face twisted into a grimace that seemed disturbingly human. The construction company brought in a local historian to examine the bones, and as he sifted through the soil, he unearthed relics that told a grim story. Rusted tools, fragments of a wooden cross, and the remains of what looked like a crude burial shroud made from burlap. Among the artifacts was an old ledger, pages half rotted but still legible enough to reveal names and dates. The last entry, dated back to the late 1800s, was written in a shaky hand and read, "Jacob Hayes, purchaser of the Barrett Farm." As the historian continued his research, he uncovered rumors from decades past, stories about the land changing hands frequently, with every new owner fleeing within weeks, leaving behind fields choked with weeds and abandoned homes slowly falling apart. Those who lived nearby told of strange figures seen wandering the fields at dusk, shapes that seemed to be stitched together with rags and old clothes, with faces as pale as burlap. Then the historian found something even more chilling, a mention of a caretaker named Gideon Thorne, who had lived on the property for as long as anyone could remember. It was said he rarely aged and was always present whenever the land changed hands, offering his services to each new owner with a smile that never reached his eyes. Some speculated that he was not a man at all, but something else entirely, a spirit bound to the land, a keeper of secrets that should have been buried forever. When the historian relayed his findings to the developers, he was met with skepticism. But then came the final horror. One morning, the shallow grave was found disturbed, the earth freshly churned. Inside the pit, the bones were rearranged, and at the very center lay the historian's broken body, his mouth stuffed with straw and his hands tied with frayed burlap. The scarecrows, which had been removed just the day before, now stood in a perfect circle surrounding the grave, their faces all turned toward the farmhouse ruins as if awaiting something. The authorities closed the site indefinitely, and no one dared to approach the old farm again. It remains untouched, surrounded by a rusting wire fence and a tangled thicket of weeds. The scarecrows still stand at the perimeter, their cloth bodies worn thin by the wind, but their faces remain disturbingly intact, gazing out over the cursed land. Locals say that if you walk by at dusk, you can still see them shifting slightly in the breeze, and some swear they can hear a faint whisper on the wind, a voice calling out names in the dark, always ending with Jacob Hayes. And no one knows what became of Gideon Thorne, but some say a shadowy figure can still be seen wandering the edge of the woods, watching over the land that has consumed so many souls. Others claim that the scarecrows now serve as his sentinels, their hollow eyes watching and waiting for the next unfortunate soul to trespass on the ground that should have remained forever untouched. If you have enjoyed this haunting tale, be sure to leave a thumbs up for it. Join the Twilight of Horror army by hitting the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single terrifying upload. Thank you for watching, and stay afraid.